Hey,
I forget the setup of this. I don't think we got like two
nah,
passes, right? It's just like with
nah,
one you're
I'm
just streaming
just,
again, or
yeah, I'm just about, just was pulling up the link here. So
gotcha. Okay.
I was thinking I was just gonna like, oh yeah, let's watch this from home and I can do a little bit of cleaning while I was listening to it. And then I was like, oh crap, I gotta run back to the office. I gotta stream this from
Oh,
work.
right.
So yeah, so it's
Sorry.
no, I was just like, oh yeah, it was like 10 minutes, and I was like, wait, oh
Well,
crap,
you could probably let it go now and then go home and stream
yeah,
it
that's what
yourself.
I'm gonna do. So
Gotcha. Okay.
yeah, so
Okay.
as soon as it goes live here, uh, it should be
Yeah.
good.
And
So
it's even recording too, so we'll even have that, right?
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah. Nice. Okay.
yeah. Certainly mine's recording. Yeah, I don't know about
Mhm.
their stuff, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, they usually don't send out a recording to everybody because then like you just only have
Yeah.
one,
Right.
you know.
Yeah. 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 That makes sense. All right. Well, this should be interesting. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if they'll have anything yet, but it'll at least be like I know everybody's telling me pricing is like plummeting and equity is harder to get, and like
Hmm.
it'll at least reinforce that or kind of hopefully they'll like try to quantify that a little bit.
Yeah.
So I'm not like yeah, like I'm hearing a lot of stuff from the investors, but it'll
Yeah.
at least give me some kind of filter on that. So okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Sounds good. Well, yeah. Should be should be live in a minute, I think. So. All
Okay,
right.
I'll let you know
Bye.
for that.
Sounds good. Well, yeah. Should be should be live in a minute, I think. So. All
Okay,
right.
I'll let you know
Bye.
for that.
Recording in progress.
All right, Zoom takes a moment to let everybody in. So welcome everyone to Novogradic's 2024 Election Effects on Community Development Tax Incentives webinar. That's a mouthful. We're joined here today by Novogradic's managing partner, Mike Novogradic, and Novogradic's Director of Public Policy, Peter Lawrence. They'll be able to introduce themselves a little bit more in a second, but we've got a handful of housekeeping items we want to cover quickly. Public Policy and Government Relations, Peter. Apologies. That's the full title. Nice. All right. So just quickly, your opportunity to interact with the presenters today is via the Q&A pane. If you want your question to be anonymous, there is a box there for that. I want to temper expectations, however, because we've got a pretty full slate of content today and we have a very large group. So feel free to submit your comment and they'll do their best to pick out themes maybe of questions or comments that have been submitted. We are recording, and everyone who's here today who's purchased this live webinar will be receiving an email with a link to access that recording, and it will expire 1 year from today. The handout is going to be linked here in the chat window, and there was also an email sent out earlier this morning with links to 1 slide per page and 2 slide per page versions of the slides. And then finally, post-webinar survey. There's going to be a button that pops up in your browser that says, do you want to do the survey? You click on that and let us know how they did and what additional topics you might want to hear about more in depth in the future. Brief advisory, this will be made available as well for any of your colleagues who didn't make it to the live presentation. It'll take us a few days to render it and convert it to a for purchase recording, but we expect that to be up by the end of the week. And then we'll jump to our disclaimer and copyright notice, etc. I think the big takeaway here is that this is not a substitute for formal legal tax professional advice. And with that, let's turn things over to Mike and Peter.
Great, thank you, Wayne. And thank you, Peter, for joining me here. And thanks to all of you who are watching this training session, this webinar. I do want to encourage you to ask questions. As Wayne noted, we likely can't get to all the questions in the Q&A, but the questions help guide us in terms of the issues that we should be focused on and could be a preview of a future Tax Credit Tuesday podcast or a Washington report for the Journal of Tax Credits or a blog post by Peter in some way, or a key talking point at one of our upcoming conferences. So please submit as many questions as you can as they arise. And those that we can do, we'll bring in the course of the discussion here. And we do have an ambitious agenda. We're going to start off with the 2024 election results, just to sort of level set. There's no real breaking news there, but there are implications of the actual more detailed results in terms of what can and can't happen in a lame duck session, more significantly next year. We are going to go through this somewhat sequentially in the sense that we first want to talk about what the lame duck agenda and possibilities are. And that would be the lame duck session of Congress, where all the current members, those elected 2 years ago, will come back and deal with legislative matters for the latter half of this year, with the new Congress taking office next year. We also want to focus on what some of the anticipated priorities for the Trump administration will be. Obviously, this is anticipated priorities, and we'll wait and see what the priorities turn out to be. And it's anticipated based upon the campaign and other dialogue that Peter and I have had with so many. And then we're going to spend a reasonable amount of time on next year, which I'm sure is drawing a lot of you as attendees of this webinar. And that has been colloquially referred to as the Super Bowl of tax. And that, of course, is the Tax Cut and Jobs Act expirations that happen at the end of 2025 and much more. And then we also, time permitting, will cover some of the rumored Trump cabinet nominees, as well as focus on some regulatory policy possibilities. I will note that the PDF slides do have a lot more information, and if this goes a little bit faster than we're sort of anticipated, we might touch upon some of the appendix resources, but just know that we do have the congressional committee leadership information as an appendix to this presentation on the PDF, as well as housing and development legislation that's been introduced this year that will all have to be reintroduced in January of next year. So there's no real news flash here. The 2024 election results are in. President Trump will be become president, take the oath of office on January 20th. And the House of Representatives will be controlled by the Republicans, with Mike Johnson, the likely speaker. And the Republicans will control the Senate, and Senator John Thune was elected the leader of the Republicans. Mitch McConnell, as many of you know, stepped down, is not running for it, that being the leader for next year. So Senator John Thune will be the majority leader next year. And there was a race there with Senator Thune and Senator Cornyn from Texas and Senator Scott of Florida, and Senator Thune won on the second ballot. And Peter, maybe you could talk a bit about the 2024 election results, as what we know in terms of the majorities, and then maybe comment a bit about how the significance of the majorities or lack of a substantial majority can impact legislation next year.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks again for all of you for joining the webinar today. So what we know as of this moment, according to the Associated Press, there are 218 Republicans have been elected to the House, and 212 Democrats, and there are 5 uncalled races. And if the leads that are currently in the count, in the uncalled race, the 5 uncalled races, we will result in the 119th Congress, the next Congress starting January 3rd of 2025, will have 221 Republicans and 214 Democrats, which incidentally, Mike, it's the exact same ratio as right now. But I will say the big dynamic changed is that because there isn't a Democratic Senate and a Democratic White House, we do anticipate that President-elect Trump will be able to bend his will and get House Republicans to follow his agenda much better than we've seen the House sort of maintain discipline over the course of these past 2 years. So doesn't mean that it's going to be 100% complete smooth sailing, but I don't anticipate the same disruption we saw with the narrow margins in the House for the next 2 years, and we'll talk about that more in the upcoming slides.
Let me just note, Peter, on the House side also, is when you do think of 435 seats, and if the Republicans end up at 221 to 214, the health of various members and the rest really begins to matter. And it seems like in the course of a Congress, there's usually 2 or 3 seats are constantly available and open due to one issue or the other, not the least of which could be, for this Republican Party, some of those getting elected taking a position in the Trump administration such that the seat becomes vacant and then has to have a special election, which can take 60, 90, 120 days for a seat to be vacant. So you're dealing with 435, a majority of 3 can be quite challenging. But with that said, let's move on to the Senate.
Okay, fair enough. So on the Senate, as we did anticipate, given the map that was presented and the fact there were a lot more Democrats up this cycle than Republicans, they have taken control of the Senate, and we see here reflected in the key races that Republicans defeated 4 incumbents, or rather 3 incumbents and 1 open seat flipped to Republican control, and that changed the Senate from the 51 Democrats and independents to 49 Republicans to, in this Congress, to 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats and independents in the upcoming Senate. And strangely enough, even though it's the same margin in the Senate as the House, I think that 3-seat margin is much more comfortable in the Senate. You can have, say, for example, Senators Collins and Murkowski maybe not vote, but still have a comfortable margin to pass key legislation with that type of majority. So I think in some respects, I think the Senate will be, much more, less of a concern for Republicans than the House will be.
Yeah, 6% of 50 versus 1.5% of 218. That's quite a difference. So let's talk a bit about the timeline to once again level set the audience. We're obviously at November 19th today. Whoops. And then we know that the previously was passed a continuing resolution to December 20th. And that continuing resolution expires on December 20th. And right now, there's every expectation that the continuing resolution to fund the federal government will be extended either into March, such that the new Congress would have to go through the budgeting process and pass budget bills, or it could be extended out until September 30th. That being through the into the fiscal year 2025. The big driver from the incoming Trump administration is, they're looking at it thinking, well, if you could get this funding through September 30th this year, it's something we don't have to deal with early next year. We can focus on other priorities. On the flip side, there can be the notion of pushing it out into next year so the new Congress can execute on their priorities. And that'll be the discussion what's happening with the continuing resolution. And then there's also a potential disaster recovery bill, which we'll talk about in a bit. Peter and I did want to also note that the debt limit expires on January 1, which means all things being equal, the government couldn't borrow anymore. However, all things are never equal in Washington, D.C., and there's something known as extraordinary measures, which likely allows the debt limit to not really kick in and limit government borrowing and ability to fund the government, I should say, until sometime in May. And April 15th, the tax filing season, is a big date. Both March 15th is a big date and April 15th, because March 15th, you end up having the corporate filing times. And to the extent those filings, those are usually months where a large amount of revenue comes in. And then in the later months, it ends up getting spent, which causes the need to borrow. So that's what we're looking at in terms of the debt limit. And that's something we're really not going to spend much time in the course of this webinar talking about the debt limit and the implications, but it definitely will be an issue that has to get addressed, and there'll be lots of jockeying around as Congress attempts to address the extension. And then, as I noted earlier, January 20th is Inauguration Day. And on January 3rd, that's the beginning of the 119th Congress. That's when the election of the speaker and such should occur, hopefully with not the fanfare that it's had in prior years. And then the election certification of the president will be on January 6th. And then the big news and the big focus of this conference is just how the TCJA expirations happen at the end of next year. And that's what's going to lead to the Super Bowl tax. And the Ways and Means Committee is targeting passing a tax bill under the reconciliation process, which we'll talk about more later, within the first 100 days, within the first 3 months. There's different references, but there is an attempt to get out there kind of aggressively and get a tax bill introduced and out of the Ways and Means Committee, and then as well as the full House, and get it over to the Senate. And with that as an overall lay of the land, Peter, what did you want to mention or highlight before we move on to with this presentation?
Yeah, it's going to be a very tight timeline, and we know the House has been preparing all through the course of the year. They formed back last April 10 tax teams to focus on the possibility that the Republicans would sweep the election and have a trifecta of control of the White House, House and Senate. That did happen, and so they're going to execute on that planning to try to pass the reconciliation bill as quickly as possible. As you noted, they still also have to deal with a debt limit amidst that. That's going to be a little bit of a competition and competing priority for the first 6 months. But I think, as we've often said before, Mike, I think reconciliation there's no option for failure here. However difficult it will be, we'll talk about how difficult it will be. I think many Republicans view this opportunity as too good to pass up, and therefore they're going to do everything they can to find the necessary 218 votes in the House and 50 votes in the Senate to pass a reconciliation bill.
Great, thank you for that, Peter. And when you see me looking to the right, I have the questions and answers on my right. So, a great question came in about how many members of the Congress, both Republican and Democrat, in both the Senate and the House, were there back in 2017. And in the Senate, since the Senate has 6-year terms, roughly 2/3 of the Senate was there in 2017. Bearing in mind that in 2017 it was passed with Republican-only votes, just like the Inflation Reduction Act was passed with Democratic-only votes. And then in the House, it's roughly 1/3 of the House members were there. In 2-year terms, there's a lot more turnover in the House. So you are dealing with a huge education need of members of the House as to what happened in 2017. And I believe the number of members in the actual Tax Writing Ways and Means Committee is 5 or 6 that were actually there back in 2017. So within the subset of the Ways and Means Committee, there is a huge education effort that's been underway and needs to continue. And that's one of the reasons why the House created these tax teams to address the coming need for a tax bill to deal with the TCJA expirations. And we won't go into the tax teams and all the rest, but a lot of the topics that we're covering here, we did do a podcast that we dug down more deeply back when they were initially formed and the like. But Peter, let's talk super briefly about lame duck agenda and possibilities. We know that the president recently submitted a request for $100 billion of disaster supplemental funding. And we also know that with the tax bill that the House passed overwhelmingly earlier this year, that's now stalled in the Senate, had a number of tax provisions that a couple of them would have been very good for the loan-funded tax rate community if they had been sort of enacted. But that did include a disaster tax relief piece. And there's some thought that with this grant funding, if you will, of disaster relief, dollars for FEMA, dollars for SBA disaster loan funding, and CDBGR disaster relief, that there will also be this disaster tax relief principally for individuals. And as part of that, if you could discuss the possibility of there even being an additional aspect of the tax package dealing with disaster tax relief that could affect community development incentives.
Sure. So I think there's a very decent chance that in the lame duck, they will pass that somewhere around not $100 billion disaster supplemental funding. The hurricanes Helene and Milton were very devastating, and there's I think a pent-up demand from many members of Congress to try to address the tremendous recovery needs affected by those disasters. And they also stretch back to the devastating fires in Maui last year. And that the president's request for roughly $100 billion does reach back that far. And there have been several press reports saying that many in House leadership want to take that piece of the Wyden-Smith tax bill that was originally authored by Representative Stubbe to provide a disaster tax relief for individuals and add that to the disaster supplemental. And what that does is it makes the overall legislation a tax bill and therefore a vehicle for tax legislation. And I think we're hearing initial reports that there's maybe some interest in what we're calling a Go Zone Light package. For those of you just to recall, actually next year will be the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina and the Go Zone Act. And that provided a very significant amount of disaster low-income housing tax credits, $1 billion in disaster new markets allocation authority, and increased the historic tax percentage for properties in the disaster zones from 20% to 26%. And we're hearing that there's a possibility that similar provisions might be included in whatever Congress considers. And I think if you're someone who is trying to do work in disaster recovery in those areas, then certainly want to encourage you to reach out to your member of Congress to talk about how the history of the Go Zone Act and how incredibly valuable it was to help recover from the devastating disaster that Hurricane Katrina presented. And this has happened several times as recently as December 20th, signed by President Trump as one of his last acts before leaving office, to authorize $1.25 billion in disaster and low-income housing tax credits for 11 states. So I do think it's something to keep an eye on, and a possibility that might occur sometime in the lame duck.
So in addition to the disaster relief, there's also a lot of discussion among all of us community development professionals as to the possibility that the House bill that I mentioned earlier, that passed the House overwhelmingly and then installed in the Senate, what its chances are. I mentioned that the Stubbe provisions would have been could be pulled out for disaster relief. That tax provision could be pulled out of that bill, but that bill also provided some additional funding for 9% LIHTC, as well as lowering the 50% tests down to 30%. And if you could just kind of explain briefly some of the potential ways that could come into enactment before the end of the year.
Yes, so we're keeping an eye out, and while I do think there's a very good chance of a disaster, it's going to be a harder row for broader
Agreed.
Tax provisions. Much as we would love for the provisions from the Wyden-Smith bill on increasing 9% allocations more broadly, and lowering the private activity bond financing threshold to be considered in any of these must-pass pieces of legislation that we have here on the slide. It doesn't appear very likely that to happen. Now, of course, we don't do any advocacy at all. Will definitely not happen. And so it is absolutely worth reaching out to your member of Congress to ask them to consider. And it only will help because it'll help prime the pump for whatever happens next year, as we're going to talk about in the Super Bowl of tax. But I do think there is going to be an effort, but the chances are going to be, it's going to be tough because Congress, I think in many respects, is already thinking about 2025 as a major tax year, and the disaster is an immediate priority. Everything else, it may have to wait till next year.
So moving on to the anticipated priorities for Trump administration, and I think we all know that incoming or President-elect Trump focused on immigration and border control quite a bit in his campaign. So we know that'll be a focus. We also know that an all of the above energy policy will be a focus. And then we know that extending TCJA will be a central focus. And then there are every expectation that there'll be additional revenue to the federal government from tariffs. We'll talk more about the implications of the tariffs in connection with TCJA and the cost of extending TCJA. And then there's also been a lot of discussion about lowering of the corporate tax rate for domestic manufacturing. And within the long-term tax credit community in particular, there's a lot of concern about, will the corporate tax rate be adjusted? Will it go down for all corporations? And right now, it's difficult to envision that the corporate tax rate would go down for all corporations, and that the concept of a 15% corporate rate, at best we could assess now, would be limited to domestic manufacturing. That being said, we have to be mindful as to what the Trump team says over the next, week, 2 weeks, month, 2 months, 3 months, to see if that view has changed at all. But given the overall cost, it does seem to me a bit fanciful to think that the overall corporate rate of 21% could be lowered across the board below the 21%. But it's certainly something that we're watching and paying very close attention to. And then the other aspect of the priorities for Trump administration is on the campaign trail, he discussed a lot of additional tax cuts. And we'll talk about those later in the course of this webinar. But those other campaign tax cuts come at a pretty high cost. Peter, what did I miss?
No, I think there are certainly maybe other campaign promises. We couldn't possibly address all of them in this webinar, but these were the ones that we felt were most prominent that we wanted to feature and may end up impacting in some fashion the community development incentives. But here, as you point out, let's dive into some of these key ones and how they might potentially affect the priorities in 2025.
So when you look at the cost estimates of the Trump campaign proposals, extending the Tax Cut and Jobs Act without extending or raising the $10,000 per tax return SALT cap, or the state and local tax cap on deductions, is $5.35 trillion over a 10-year period. And that's roughly 1.5% of GDP over that period of time. He also talked about exempting overtime income, and that would be a $2 trillion number. Exempting Social Security benefits, the portion that's taxable, $1.3 trillion. Exempting tip income, we all heard of President Trump going to Nevada and talking about exempting income on tips. That's costing $300 billion. And some of these cost estimates are obviously super rough. And, if certain of these tax changes were put into effect, compensation structures would adjust to take into account the different tax treatments. So the cost estimates could skyrocket. We already mentioned the 15% corporate tax rate for manufacturers. He also talked about a first-time home buyer's tax credit, but these various proposals, including the modernizing the military of $400 billion and securing the border with $350 billion, would increase interest costs roughly $1 trillion. So obviously the big number here is $11.1 trillion of additional cost over 10 years. And bear in mind, the current national debt held by the public is roughly 25 or 27 trillion. So that is obviously a very, very substantial number before taking into account revenue enhancements. And then when you look at revenue enhancements that have been talked about, one we've all heard is the increased tariffs. And if there was an across-the-board increase in tariffs, it could raise 2.7 trillion. I mean, that's a rough estimate from the Committee for Responsible Budget, as well as, our sources are that in tax notes. Reversing energy policies, repealing the IRA provisions, which we do not think will happen. But if it did happen, that would be a $700 billion number. And we'll spend more time later talking about which provisions we think are more at risk and how we expect more of a scalpel than a wholesale repeal. And then there's also some school choice changes that would be a revenue raiser, as well as what we hear every administration talking about is getting money from cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. And I don't know, Peter, if you have any additional comments you wanted to make before I go about some of the other ways to raise revenue on the cost estimates or the revenue estimates.
Yeah, no, we know there's going to be incredible pressure to find revenue raisers to help offset the cost of all these extensions. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in particular. And a lot of things will be at risk, and we need to be vigilant. And we'll talk about how things are different from 2017 in a moment. And so, but at the same time, I think no one can be complacent here. And I think, we're going to need sustained advocacy throughout this entire, reconciliation bill process to make sure the community development tax incentives are protected and potentially enhanced through the reconciliation legislation.
And just some other potential revenue raisers, and it's not particularly exhaustive. Obviously, there's only we only list up here sort of 5. I just would note that the tax on university endowments that could be raised. There's also the notion that since individuals are limited in their ability to deduct state and local taxes, perhaps a similar limit should be put in place for corporations and limits corporations' ability to deduct state and local taxes. Now, I will note that for those of you that work with state tax credits, I mean, right now, one of the issues with state tax credits is a corporation can deduct it. So if they're paying for a state tax credit, they know that 21% of that state tax they get back in a federal deduction benefit. So they're in essence looking at a 79% of that credit as creating them a permanent value. If that same local tax deduction was limited, then $1 of state tax credit saved would be $1 of cash saved by the corporation. So it would lead to a notable increase in the value of state tax credits to corporations. So that's one that would actually have an indirect positive effect on the value of state tax credit community development incentives. There's also talk of raising the stock buyback tax, and then the global minimum tax. We've talked about on various podcasts and the like. The global minimum tax is essentially dead as we know it with the Republican sweep in terms of the U.S. Involvement in it. And if the U.S. isn't involved in it, it's once again, it's a bit fanciful to think that the rest of the world will just move forward irrespective as to what the U.S. does with respect to it. So on the slide, we just named it as revised global minimum tax. You might think about revised, international tax system with GILTI and the rest, but definitely there's a lot that can be done in that international area to raise potential revenue. And then there's also been a lot of talk on cutting back on the remaining $60 billion or so of IRS funding, which Peter has reminded me many times that it actually you save the 60 billion, but the actual revenue loss, because when the JCT scores IRS funding, they score that their auditing more leads to more money than they spend. So it's actually a revenue loser from a scoring perspective if you cut back on IRS funding. Other comments, Peter?
No, that's basically it. I mean, I would expect that the $60 billion in IRS spending for enforcement still might be gotten rid of in reconciliation because Republicans have really been campaigning against it. It's probably the one thing that is disliked the most from the Inflation Reduction Act. But I don't think it's going to be able to be used to help significantly pay for the tax expirations next year.
And then I would also just say everything else in the tax code that could potentially be adjusted, you have to be thinking about as ways to raise a little bit of money here, a little bit of money there, as well as on the domestic spending side, having to identify what may or may not happen on the domestic spending side to help offset the shortage in revenue that these tax cuts would create. So Peter, if you could share a few thoughts on the RNC, Republican National Committee platform. They had some comments on housing. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it because it's not as if President Trump's going to be looking at the RNC plan as a checklist of what to do, but it does at least directionally provide some sense as to what's been said publicly as to the Republican approach to dealing with housing affordability.
Sure, and I will say, I think one of the key election items was the fact that the Trump campaign realizes that many folks voted for him because of their concerns about inflation. And I think it's no surprise that they're going to be talking about how they want to keep inflation low as part of one of their priorities to address that, reverse the problems that they focused on with President Biden. I do think it's interesting the opening up federal lands for housing development. There are especially in the West, there are lots of land owned by the federal government, and some of which might be suitable for land development. So I do think, and we've just seen in general, one of the key strategies in advancing affordable housing is the question of getting the appropriate land. So any ways that you get land on a discounted basis would certainly be welcome on that front. And I'll just note that promoting homeownership through tax incentives, it's pretty vague. I mean, there have been some talk about a tax incentive for home buyers, but I think the other aspect that we're keeping an eye out on, and we'll talk about some more, is the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which would provide a tax credit for the development of single-family housing for starter homes. And I think that the RNC platform there could be a helpful indication that's something that the Trump administration be willing to get behind. So those are some of the key issues we're following.
Okay, Peter. Now let's talk about the Super Bowl of tax next year. And we've already discussed the deficit impact of extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions, and just more detail of the various provisions. And this is from the Joint Committee on Taxation. And these numbers, every year they just go up because every year you have another year that you're extending it to. But this is the most recent cost estimate of the individual provisions, from reducing individual income tax rates, the 20% pass-through deduction, repeal of AMT for most taxpayers. And basically, back in 2017, so many of these provisions were set to end within the 10-year scoring window, because as we'll talk about more in a minute, after 10 years, it has to be revenue neutral. So basically, if nothing happens with TCJA, the code that was in the rules that were in place before just kind of automatically sort of kick in. So it's kind of comparing what the rules, if they automatically kicked in that were there before, what the cost is to keep the rules as they are now. And the only one item I want to point out on here is it shows a $70 billion cost for opportunity zones. That $70 billion cost is not realistic, in the sense that they scored something that no one within the opportunity zones community is going to ask for. So the actual extension of opportunity zones will be a fraction, a very small fraction of that number. And then overall, it just is as we noted earlier, $5.7 trillion, 1.5% of GDP. It's sort of a big number. And when I think about how big that number is, I always just look at and say, okay, well, what is the current debt right now, and what's it scheduled to rise to over the next 10 years? And it's roughly $27 trillion now. And if the amount of the debt held by the public is projected to grow to 50 trillion, and that's if the TCJA expires and the other kicks in and the rest. When you look at the GDP of the U.S., you can look at the current GDP. The debt is 95% of GDP. And based upon the current budget over the next 10 years, it's scheduled to rise to 122% of GDP. And when you look at that, if the 5.7 was incurred at 5.7 trillion, slightly less, yes, 5.3, depending on how you measure it, the overall debt would go up to 56 trillion. And as a consequence, the projected debt as a percentage of GDP rises to 135%. And I do expect that as the course of the discussion happens about how big of a tax cut to have, how much more debt to be scheduled to incur over 10 years, the fact that a provision generates economic activity to help drive up GDP is going to be very relevant. And I do think we'll hear more and more discussion of debt as a percentage of GDP as some of the measures that'll get used. But let's, Peter, if you could explain to everyone, because a lot of our webinar attendees were here in 2017, and when they think of Republicans changing the tax code, their mind goes to 2017, and a bit of PTSD kicks in terms of how we were fighting to keep certain tax provisions that were eliminated in the House, getting them back in the Senate and the rest. And if you could share why why 2025 is not 2017.
Sure, and just to remind folks, in the initial House passed version of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, private activity bonds were eliminated. So all the housing that private activity bonds finance would have gone away. At the time, we estimated about 1 million affordable homes. And then there was the elimination of the early termination of the new markets tax credit and had gotten a 5-year extension in the PATH Act of 2015, and the elimination of the historic tax credits. That would have been a pretty devastating version of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But thanks to advocacy of folks on this webinar and elsewhere, private activity bonds were saved, and new markets were saved, and historic tax credits were retained at a over changing from a 1-year historic tax credit to a 5-year tax credit. And I think one of the things we want to just emphasize why 2025 is different is that we have a different speaker and different House Ways and Means Committee chair. Paul Ryan and Kevin Brady were not fans of the community development tax incentives, and we had a hard road to road against that opposition. We have a very, very different scenario with Representative Mike Johnson, who has expressed support for the historic tax credit. Louisiana is one of the states that punches above its weight on this historic tax credit utilization. And Jason Smith has been a co-sponsor of all of the various community development tax legislation. In fact, was the lead sponsor of the Rural Jobs Act, which would provide an extra $1 billion in new markets tax credit authority, and has spoken at several of our new markets tax credit conferences. It's really light years difference in the mentality of the community development incentives with the key tax policymakers in the House. That's not to say we can, again, be complacent. We still all need to make sure we advocate, but I do think we start off at a much more advantageous situation as they embark in this major 2025 tax legislation than we were in 2017.
So I want to go through and talk about the impact. And when we think of the various tax incentives, long-term tax credit, new markets, opportunity zones, historic tax credits, also focus on renewable energy tax credits and the like. But I thought, Peter, it would be useful when we were preparing for you first to give an overview as to what this reconciliation process means in this sense of doing it on as an overview. The whole concept of reconciliation process is a Senate-driven, there's a Senate-driven need to do this, and that's because in the Senate, if you do it through budget reconciliation, you'd only need to get a majority vote. You don't have to get the 60 votes, so it can't be filibustered. And this is how 2017 TCJA passed. It's how the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and there's a number of other bills or a number of other legislation introduced on a partisan basis, be it Republicans or Democrats, to avoid the filibuster in the Senate. And if you can talk about what that means and why it's so complicated, and it's easy to say, harder to do.
Indeed, absolutely. So the first step in passing a reconciliation bill is you first have to pass a budget resolution. And that's not so easy. If we go back to 2017, when Congress was in the process of considering the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, there were actually 19 House Republicans who voted against the budget resolution that would have triggered the ability to pass reconciliation legislation that ended up being the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Now, at the time, they had a big enough margin so that they could sustain losing 19 votes. And as you've pointed out, Mike, in previous circumstances, maybe some of those 19 could have been persuaded to vote for it if their votes were absolutely needed. But it just underscores that it's not an absolutely simple process to get a budget resolution passed. But the key part of that also, I wanted to point out, is in that budget resolution, it says this is how much they're going to be able to increase the deficit within the 10-year budget window. And that's a number to watch, because the larger it is, the more likely we'll be able to get positive community development tax incentive provisions included. The smaller it is, it'll just be harder, because given all those 5 trillion plus in extensions that they want to try to address in the legislation, if you have a much smaller number of total deficit, that just means it's going to be hard to have an expansive list of tax provisions. So that's a number I'm going to be keeping an eye on when that process goes forward. And then there'll be instructions, by the way, not only to the Ways and Means and Finance Committee, which leads the tax legislation. There are other committees where other spending might be cut, other mandatory spending to help pay for the overall package. So that is something to keep an eye on. And we'll talk a little bit about those other, the implications of those other committees writing reconciliation instructions. But then, of course, if once you get to that stage, then you do have to pass the budget reconciliation bill. And the key piece there in the Senate is it must follow the Byrd rule. And the Byrd rule has 3 main components. One is, all provisions in the reconciliation bill have to have a fiscal impact. And that fiscal impact can't be merely incidental to a policy change. And one example of that is Democrats tried, when they had the ability to do a reconciliation bill, to increase the federal minimum wage. And that certainly did have a fiscal impact on the federal budget, but it was considered by the Senate parliamentarian to be merely incidental, and therefore violated the Byrd rule. And then last, after the initial 10-year budget window where they specify the maximum deficit increase, you can't have the reconciliation bill increase the deficit after that 10-year budget window. And that's why you saw so many things expire in 2025, because in order to meet that requirement, many of the provisions had to expire in that year so that they wouldn't increase the deficit beyond the 10-year window for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So those same aspects will likely be confronted by Congress when they write this big 2025 tax bill. And so wouldn't be surprised if we see some more expirations in, say, 2033 or 2034. And that we may not see many things done on an indefinite basis, unless it's raising revenue, of course, which then helps address the Byrd rule concerns. And the other thing I do want to note, because of the Byrd rule, certain things like opportunity zone reporting are not likely to be considered. It was stripped out of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and since we anticipate the Congress to go this route again, it means that we're not going to be able to do opportunity zone reporting legislation in that bill.
I wanted to also note that the corporate tax rate was lowered from 35% to 21% as part of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act back in 2017, but it was not did not terminate at the end of the 10-year period. There were sufficient other changes that in isolation wasn't going to increase the deficit in those out years. So it's an indirect way or an example as to how there might be some provisions that don't expire after the 10-year period, because other provisions, and there's other calculations that JCT is doing that causes the net effect of the bill to not be increasing the deficit in those out years. So now let's run through the various tax areas, the tax incentive areas that I know of concern and driving so many of you to this webinar. And I did see a question in about the IRA, durability of various IRA incentives, and we will be talking about each of the sort of major tax incentive areas where Novogradac works. And I thought, Peter, please start with some of the legislative impact provisions. We're trying to break it out between what Congress, principally through budget reconciliation, might do with respect to these various tax incentives, both additive as well as potentially subtracting. And then we also want to touch upon possible regulatory impacts And once again, please submit questions through the Q&A pane. We may not get to them all here, but it's useful to hear what your issues are, what you're concerned about, so that we at Novogradac can be addressing those matters.
Yes.
Peter?
Thanks, Mike. And so where we start, of course, is with the Wyden-Smith housing credit provisions, as well as the broader Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which I'll note has currently over 270 co-sponsors. It's the most bipartisan piece of tax legislation in this Congress, and it's a tremendous achievement that we've gotten that level of support for the legislation, and that's all going to help increase the chance that provisions from that bill will be included in whatever Congress considers a tax reconciliation bill. And first and foremost is an increase on the 9% credits, most notably restoring the 12.5% increase that expired at the end of 2021. Lowering the 50% test. In Wyden-Smith, it would go down to 30%, but of course in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, it was proposed to go down as far as 25%. And I think this will all be sort of driven by how much resources that Congress decides to, if they decide to devote any, how much they will devote to housing. And then of course the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act also had basis boosts for rural areas, for Native American communities, and to extend the existing law discretion states have to provide basis boosts for 9% developments, to do that for private activity bond financed properties. You mentioned the corporate rate as something we're absolutely looking at, as if it is lowered to 15% generally, not just for manufacturing. That would certainly impact housing credit equity pricing in a negative fashion. But if they decide, and this has been talk about it, of course, of the year, that even despite, I guess, candidate Trump, now President Trump, being in favor of a cut to the corporate rate, there was whispers of potentially it going up to help pay for the expirations of other provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Right. Let me just sort of weigh in there, Peter, in terms of the change, because the President Trump's talked about the lowering the rate of 50% for domestic, as I mentioned earlier. And the notion of the rate going up from 21% seems less likely with Trump as president. There have been talk in the past about whether or not even some Republicans in Ways and Means might see a need for a slightly higher corporate tax rate to pay for everything else. And I certainly won't say that that's off the table, but the fact that President Trump sort of ran on the benefits of TCJA and extending it, and the corporate rate was 21. It's hard for me right now to see it going up, but there's lots of things that are going to happen over the next 12 months that I can't see today. So please go on to the state of the private activity bond tax exemption, Peter, since you did note earlier that as part of TCJA, the House had repealed the exemption that was put back by the Senate. So we get lots of questions about what's the chances of that being on the table again.
Well, as we noted also, we do think that 2025 is different from 2017, excuse me. And I do think we have heard chatter and concern, and I think, again, you never can be complacent about it, that the tax exemption for private activity bonds might be removed. I do think the chances are lower now than they were in 2017. But it's something that we are keeping an eye on, and it's certainly obviously would be devastating to the low-income housing tax credit.
And let me just also note that this is one of those provisions, and a lot of what we're talking about here is some of these I look at and say we have nothing to fear but the lack of fear itself. If we're fearful that it's going to happen and we're advocating and staying engaged, its chance of happening aren't very great. If all of a sudden everyone goes radio silent on some of these sorts of issues, and then the notion of something like this happening goes up dramatically. Indeed,
absolutely. That's why we want to raise that flag.
Right.
And then the last two items there, I do think the return of 100% expensing, sometimes referred to as 100% bonus depreciation, that was a part of Wyden-Smith. We do think it will be considered as part of. It's a big Republican priority, and there will be some version of that. It may not be retroactive like the Wyden-Smith version of the bonus depreciation, but it is something we are anticipating to be restored for some portion of time as part of the reconciliation legislation. And then we're going to talk about more in particular about opportunity zones, but we know that there's, I think, a desire to try to make the housing credit work better with opportunity zones. And we've heard from members of Congress that there's a desire for them to do that as well. And so we're keeping an eye on any provisions along those lines in the reconciliation bill.
And I do want to note, Peter, that as part of the budget reconciliation, when we talk about the 10-year scoring window, and then after that, it has to be revenue neutral. Well, within that 10-year scoring window, it is quite possible that legislation gets passed, that it's not the full 10 years, it's not even 8 or 9 years, maybe it's 5 years. And there's certain ways in which some of these could be extended for a period of time, and not the longest period of time, as a way to keep the revenue cost down, or even make the revenue cost more minor over the full 10-year period, and basically turn a lot of these provisions into extenders at some future date. And it's certainly not the best governance in terms of a tax policy, but from a scoring perspective, everything is sort of on the table in terms of how long the extensions are, based upon what the overall net cost is. So it's definitely going to be something where on all these various questions, we're going to have to be looking at them pretty closely and constantly monitoring as more and more items take shape, and the bill ultimately a bill comes out of the House and then gets considered by the Senate, and there'll be a lot of machinations along the way. In terms of regulatory impact, we're going to talk more later about the Community Reinvestment Act changes and the current status and what we expect there, which will end up affecting loan-free tax credits and new markets and others. So we'll skip that while we're here. The same thing with bank capital charges, in terms of what the bank capital charges are. And since banks are such big investors in so many of these incentives, the amount of capital they have to hold against equity investments and tax credits is very relevant to their interest and their net economic benefits of investing in these credits. So we'll cover both of those later. And I did want to note that one question that's sort of coming up with the Novoco is, earlier this year or last year, HUD created this overall 10% cap on area median incomes, which does affect the maximum rent increases on various properties. And as this 10% cap was done at the administrative level, a regulatory level. I myself wonder to what extent a new HUD secretary, a new HUD political staff, to what extent they'll look at that 10% cap and think HUD got it just right, or to what extent they think that it should be adjusted. So that's one item. There are a lot of other items that we have on LIHTC and bonds or regulatory impact, but there's only so much time. And as you see in the lower right, I'd encourage everyone who's working in these various areas to consider joining the various working groups that we have at Novoco that are really on the ground trying to provide comments and insights on what's happening. So Peter, let's move on to new market tax credits. And if you could do the same in terms of giving a sense of what, in a legislative perspective, is possible.
Yes, indeed. And I think it's worth just reiterating, the new markets credit does expire at the end of 2025. We just today, the CDFI fund announced a double round, the final set of allocations, the $10 billion of allocation authority for new markets. So once that has been awarded, there is no more authority. And so we do think one of the items that will be considered in 2025 tax legislation will be either extending the new markets credit or potentially, and we think it's absolutely proved its worth after 25 years of being made an indefinite part or a permanent part of the tax code. And I think the core of what's legislative possible is the permanent legislation that has been introduced and reintroduced over several Congresses, and that would, just as a reminder, set the initial allocation authority amount at $5 billion with annual inflation adjustments, much like the housing credit is inflation adjusted, and would also allow the new markets tax credit to offset alternative minimum tax liability, which would help encourage to get individual investors to be interested in investing in the new markets credit. So that's the core. And then beyond that, there's the Rural Jobs Act, which the chair, Jason Smith, House Ways and Means chair, Jason Smith has championed. And we do think that has a chance to be considered in reconciliation reduction, and maybe even also eliminating the basis reduction for new markets. As I think we've all commented in your testimony, Mike, at the Senate Finance Committee this July, there's a desire to try to have the community development tax incentives work better, and one of the barriers of doing that is the basis adjustment in new markets and elsewhere. So I think that's something that potentially will be considered. And the New Markets Tax Credit Coalition has several proposals beyond that, are ramping up to 10 billion over a 5-year period. If hopefully we'll be able to demonstrate that this $10 billion round of the new markets community can sustain that and effectively use those resources, and that will help make the case for having that ramp up. And then there are a number of other specific changes that will help make the new markets credit reach more areas and more populations. And I do want to note that there has been legislation to create a separate pool of new markets authority for tribal areas. So certainly think it's possible. It may not be as likely as if there was divided government, but I think that's something that's going to be in the mix. But one concern we have, and looking back to the first Trump administration, CDFI grant funding was zeroed out, proposed to be zeroed out, and so that's something we're definitely going to be keeping an eye on, because certainly if without administrative funding for CDFI fund, that makes it challenging to administer the new markets credit. So that's something that's a threat that we're monitoring.
So Peter, let's move on to the historic tax credit. And one of the key parts of my testimony in front of the Senate Finance Committee this July, just a few months ago, was making legislative changes to the historic tax credit to increase its value, because there are 4 key ways in which the value of the historic tax credit has been diminished over the last 12 or so years. And people can go back and look at my testimony to unpack what the 4 are. But one way to do that, or one of the ways in which the value was diminished, is going from a 1-year credit to a 5-year credit. So that is a high priority to see if there's a way to increase the credit make it shorter from 5-year to 1 year. And I would just note that some of the other items that are there in contention in terms of priorities for the historic tax credit come from the historic tax credit growth and opportunity act, which would be to increase the credit for smaller projects, because there is a minimum credit size to go through the syndication, the whole syndicating of a tax credit, all the rest. If it's a smaller project at a 20% credit, sometimes it's not enough to generate investor interest, as well as the capital needs that the smaller project will have. So raising that to 30%. And similar to the new market tax credit, there's also the potential to eliminate the basis adjustment. And the basis adjustment, eliminating the basis adjustment sounds like something only a tax accountant could love. But I would just point out that by eliminating the basis adjustment here, or the new market tax credit and the new market tax credit, increases the value of the credit notably, because it makes it a non-taxable credit. The longest link tax credit is non-taxable. The new market tax credit and historic tax credit are both taxable credits, and the renewable energy investment credit is 50% taxable. So removing the taxability aspect of the basis adjustment would increase the cash equity value of the credits. And then there's also the notion of reducing the substantial rehabilitation test from 100% to 50%, and also reforming the tax exempt rules such that it's easier to use the historic tax credit in connection with charitable organizations that are going to be using the property after the renovation. And then Peter, we'll talk more about CRA and bank capital charges later, but if you could say something about NPS, National Park Service reform?
Yeah, I think there is an effort in the historic tax credit community to try to change and streamline the National Park Service review. I mean, as folks know, there was a 3-part process before one could be able to claim the historic tax credit. There's been an ongoing dialogue that the historic tax credit committee has had with the National Park Service, and I do think with a new administration provides a new opportunity to try to explore ways that can be streamlined and easier to understand and go through. I mean, I think one of the sort of themes is that a try to focus on renovation rather than restoration as a theme for how the historic tax credit to work. I mean, to not insist upon restoring a property to exactly how it was in, say, 1920 and so on and so forth, but more update it and maintain its historic character while having more modern standards. I think that is something that the historic tax credit community is working with the National Park Service to try to achieve.
So the next 2 items are back-to-back opportunity zones, and then we'll talk about renewable energy and how it's how it might be adjusted with the new administration and Republican control of Congress. And in some ways, these next 2 topics, opportunity zones and renewable energy, was the same. I should note that the week of the election, on Wednesday, we had our Opportunity Zone Summit. And then the next 2 days, we had our Renewable Energy Tax Credit Conference. And it really was a tale of 2 extremes as to the impact of election results on certain legislative priorities and desires of those participating in community development and clean energy production. On the Opportunity Zone side, the fact that Donald Trump is president-elect and the House and the Senate are controlled by Republicans is a real shot in the arm for opportunity zones to be able to be renewed, as well as getting an extension. President Trump talks a lot about the significance of the opportunity zones incentive. By our estimates, over $100 billion with a B has been raised and invested in opportunity zones. That is a lot of capital going into distressed areas. And legislatively, we're looking at it and saying, in the short term, there's the ability to, there's going to be the opportunity, and we hope that we'll be successful, that the deadline for making investments is extended from 2026 for a couple of years, say to 2028. We'd like to see reporting requirements, but as Peter mentioned, if this is done through budget reconciliation, those will probably get bird ruled out. And then there's also a desire to phase out high income tracts. Once again, I don't know if that will be possible with the bird rule. If the policy, that'll definitely have a tax cost, but is the tax cost incidental to the actual policy? But the extension is one. The opportunity zone you see up there, OZ 2.0, is we think that this does present an opportunity to get a robust renewal and even permanence, such that the opportunity zones get renewed periodically by the governors, and then it's just set up at a certain time every few years, or every, it's hard to know what the time period should be, 5 years, 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, but over some period of time, over that period of time, the governors get to renew the opportunity zones with new census data and the like, as well as modernize the design of opportunity zones. So it's been very successful, but every incentive can be made better, and try to look at what's been happening on the ground and make it even better. And then there's also the potential to create a more targeted focus on rural areas to ensure that the rural areas are getting their fair share of opportunity zones investment. I do think that in many ways, rural areas are punching above their weight, particularly with respect to businesses. But there is a focus on that to ensure that that's maintained and even enhanced. And then I would say on a regulatory side, there's a number of suggestions that the Opportunity Working Group has made to both promote affordable housing and to otherwise enhance the ability to operate the opportunity zones with less friction and to better achieve the results it was intended for. And we think there'll be a more interest in the federal government to promote opportunity zones. And I think you can look across the administrations. I would expect to see every department renewing a lot of the thumb on the scale, if you will, for investments in opportunity zones. That was the case when Trump was president the first time. Now let's turn to renewable energy tax credits. And that is the area I mentioned was a tale of two conferences, in the sense that the Opportunity Zone Summit saw all this opportunity. And obviously on the renewable energy side, it's more a question of what's at risk. We know that the House Republicans had proposed repealing the Inflation Reduction Act, or large portions of it, in kind of a wholesale sledgehammer sort of approach. And I wanted to remind the audience that there were 18 House Republicans that sent a letter to leadership on the Inflation Reduction Act back in August, saying that there should be a scalpel should be used, not a sledgehammer. But clearly, renewable energy tax credits will be something that we'd expect some level of adjustment and narrowing as a revenue, as a way to generate revenue and to pursue certain policies. I will note that there is a lot of solar energy, wind energy, and the rest, and a lot of Republican states and all the rest. So I do think that that there is a lot of support, and the margin in the House will be pretty narrow. So the notion of a like a wholesale repeal or something seems off the table. It's more a question as to, on the margins, how big are the margins, and are you, as a webinar attendee, working in one of those margin areas that are subject to repeal? I'll also note that, once again, getting back to the 10-year scoring window, one area where you could see is, well, maybe there are some of these incentives that were originally scheduled for 10 years that just, they accelerate the repeal date. Instead of it going out past 10 years, it goes out to 5 years or 7 years or some other number. And then basically over the next few years, nothing changes, but in the outer years, it would become an extender. And then those years 8 through 10 would end up being revenue to help offset some of the other costs, and which kind of ties back to my earlier point, as you kind of wonder if, as part of all of this, you start seeing some only being as part of 5 years, 7 years, and basically setting yourselves up to have extenders sometime in the future. Suboptimal, but politically maybe something that sort of gets considered. Once again, there's so much as possible. But I guess I would say, Peter, for you, maybe you could comment on the IRA spending, because there's a lot of money in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and the others. There's a lot of question about, will those dollars actually be available, or will they be carved back or cut back?
Sorry, it's a great question, Mike, and I will. I just want to reiterate and underscore accelerating the sunset as a key way that we think there may be used as a pay for any extension of other provisions from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But there was, if we go back and we look, there was the overall Inflation Reduction Act was originally scored at costing $369 billion, of which 270 of that was tax incentives. So it was roughly $100 billion of spending. 27 was in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and there's sort of three buckets in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and two of those have been essentially obligated and signed over to grantees. And so I don't believe, when you look at the history of Congress rescinding spending, they typically go after unobligated funds as opposed to obligated. So those areas are more safe, more secure. But the $7 billion in Solar for All has not been obligated, and that is definitely at risk. And so if that is a resource you care about, that's something that you definitely want to be advocating for, because I imagine that it could be used as a pay for. And I also saw in the chat, or in the question and answer pane, question about the rebate programs. Several states have gotten their rebate programs approved, and therefore those funds have been obligated, but some states have not. Interestingly, there is a deadline to do it by January of next year. It was not an accident. And so I imagine that as long as the funding is obligated and approved by January 20th, then that will be much safer. But if a state hasn't obligated, hasn't approved, then that's those rebate funds are certainly at risk of being rescinded as a paid for.
And I will just say this is a good opportunity for me to remind everyone of the disclaimer at the very beginning. This is not legal advice, and you should be consulting with your attorneys as to the the ability to count on these various resources being available. And it is something that attorneys are now getting more and more questions about in terms of what steps should individual taxpayers be taking with respect to just tax benefits more generally, in terms of like a detrimental reliance, there's a retroactive changes and the like. And similarly, in terms of the various sort of funding, to what extent could a new administration actually go back and recapture those monies? And I will also say that one of the challenging parts about the times where we are right now is you don't know. The fact that it was set on the campaign trail doesn't mean it'll actually be a priority with all the other priorities the administration has. So I would just note that there are a lot of things that President Biden said when he was campaigning for the presidency that he was going to do that never saw any action at all because of all the other issues that were faced. So it's very challenging environment, obviously, or so many of you on the webinar because it's so challenging. I did want to remind folks that with respect to the podcast that we do, I do a Tax Credit Tuesday podcast every week. I know many of you listened to the podcast last week on tax credits or the inflation reduction, the election results and the impact on tax incentives and the potential repeal of parts of the Inflation Reduction Act. And we will have additional Tax Credit Tuesday episodes dealing with the ongoing knowledge that we're gaining in terms of what is or isn't possible. We're expecting some type of House tax teams report. And once that comes out, we'll likely do a Tax Credit Tuesday on the tax teams report. And then as various steps along the way, as actions happening in DC, we'll have a lot of Tax Credit Tuesday reports updating what we know at the time. And then also Tony Grapponi, a renewable energy partner of mine, has started a tax credit finance series, and we'll be discussing various election result or the election impacts on the various renewable energy as we learn more during some of those podcasts. So I did want to also give Peter a chance to talk about the potential. It's not just looking at existing incentives and moving forward with them and changing them in some ways, but I thought it was useful to also talk about some additional tax incentives that could be brought into the tax code that would presumably have to expire within that 10-year budget window, unless they were one of the lucky ones that got to stay in indefinitely, like the corporate tax rate cut did. But Peter, if you could discuss the potential for a neighborhood homes tax credit, workforce housing tax credit, office conversion credits, and a preservation tax incentive, knowing that we want to make sure we leave time for CRA as well as the bank capital requirements.
Yes, very, very briefly. I mean, neighborhood homes is very much modeled after the housing credit in new markets, but it's designed as an incentive to address what's often referred to as the appraisal gap. It's basically the cost to either construct or acquire and rehab existing single-family properties is often more than what the properties can be sold for. And so the neighborhood homes would help address that market failure in giving a tax credit to fill that gap and enable what is estimated that would help finance 500,000 starter homes throughout distressed communities across the country. And it's got very strong bipartisan support. The incoming Senate Banking Committee Chair Tim Scott recently co-sponsored the legislation. And I do think, when you mentioned, the Trump campaign platform on homeownership tax incentives, we think this is squarely in the realm of possibility for a reconciliation bill. Although, again, not probably on an indefinite basis, but a temporary basis. But I think that would help. If it were to get in, it would become an extender and able to be considered in the future. The workforce housing tax credit is also a similar new proposal. It essentially is very much based on the housing credit. In fact, states have ultimate flexibility. They would be able to use this pool of authority for either housing credit or workforce housing needs. It's purely up to them to decide how to do that, but essentially would provide an ability for states to finance rental housing to serve families up to 100% of AMI. And we've seen every year when the Harvard Joint Center on Housing Studies puts out its State of Nation housing, the cost burdens in housing are going up the income ladder, and more and more more moderate income households are finding it very hard to find affordable rental housing, and that's what it's designed to address. We also know that with the pandemic, there's been changes in a lot of the need for office and other commercial real estate, and there's a desire to try to repurpose those properties into affordable housing. There's legislation to provide $15 billion to states to help to do that. And then a new idea is emerging to help address preservation, which is also a key need. Housing supply is great, but if you've got a leaky bucket that's you're losing as many houses that you're building, you're not going to be able to advance them and address the housing crisis in an effective manner. So I think there's increasing desire to try to set up a new incentive to help preserve existing affordable rental housing and syndicate the existing tax losses in those properties to individual investors to help finance those rehabilitations. So more on that. I'm sure we'll be talking about that in future podcasts and webinars.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize the preservation tax incentive because there's such a need for renovation funds for existing affordable housing as well as for housing that could be converted to affordable. And this tax incentive is designed to be marketed to individuals, so it doesn't compete with the other tax credit market being marketed to corporations. So it's getting a new financing source of those individuals that would be interested in investing in affordable housing, getting a decent return, but also achieving a social good through allowing them to use the tax losses from ownership interest in affordable rental properties that have been renovated. So it is something that we're really excited about. And if you're out there and interested in participating, I encourage you to reach out to Karen Desteral about joining one of the working groups that we're in the process of formulating. So Peter, let's go through the Trump cabinet nominees and regulatory policy possibilities. And I do expect we'll go about 10 minutes over. Apologies for those of you. I tend to like to end on time, but I want to make sure we have time to give adequate coverage to CRA and the bank capital requirements. And I would just note with respect to the Community Investment Act that generally speaking, the three bank regulatory agencies work together with Community Reinvestment Act regulations. Back when Chairman Otting had been appointed by Trump, and then he ended up going alone as the comptroller of the currency with the OCC because he couldn't get the FDIC and Federal Reserve on board. Those rules were ultimately sort of temporarily put in place in final form. The Biden administration then pulled them back, and then came out with their own rules, which are now stuck in court. There's an injunction against the current CRA rules. And when we look at the chair of each of these, I note that Martin Gruenberg had announced resignation, and Biden does have a nominee, which are not expected to be confirmed at this point. Chairman Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve, his term ends in 2026. And we do expect that when Trump takes office, that sometime after January 20th, he'll likely replace the heads of these two agencies. And we certainly expect that the current CRA regulations that are in the courts, and there was an injunction against them going into effect, that the Trump administration would retract those regulations. So the ones that banks are operating under now, the Community Reinvestment Act regulations, would go into effect. And then the question would then become, what's the future of the Community Reinvestment Act with respect to modernization? We know modernization is needed due to online banking and the rest. But that's, really as much as we can really say right now. Anything else you'd want to say, Peter, about Community Reinvestment Act?
Yeah, I think what's going to be crucial is who does President Trump appoint for these agencies, because that will give us the indication of where things might proceed. I mean, there may be just a modest change to the regulations that were released last October, or October 2023 rather, and that that architecture is mostly sustained, or they could go back to what the former Comptroller Otting version that he proposed. I think it all will depend on who heads those agencies, and also who replaces potentially Chairman Powell and Vice Chair Barr in their roles in 2026. That could be the trigger to that whatever happens on CRA going forward. So that's something we're keeping an eye on.
And then, Peter, if you could talk about Basel III. We already talked about the Green Investment Act and the injunction and possible, what I would say is likely, retraction. But Basel III relates to international capital, capital requirements for banks. It's more about the safety and soundness of financial institutions, and as a subset of that, what amount of capital should they hold for various types of investments. And so if you could expand on that, Peter, and what you're thinking with respect to the current status of the capital requirements, that it's an international agreement, or there's international agreement. However, each country has to adopt their own local banking regulations.
Indeed, and I think one thing I think is very clear is that those July 2023 proposed regulations which by the way, were heavily influenced by a lot of bank failures back in March of 2023. Those you might remember Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic and Signature, et cetera, and so forth. I think that helped, flavor how the direction that the federal bank regulators went in those proposed regulations. There was a pretty hard pushback on those, and there had been indications before the election that they would be at a minimum reproposed. But now I believe that they will be abandoned, because they don't need to be. If they're not finalized, they're not going to go into effect. And I'm not exactly sure if they'll try to redo them, or if they'll prioritize working on other issues when it comes to federal banking regulation. And I will say, for the renewable energy community, that everyone can breathe a sigh of relief, because it did propose quadrupling the capital required, which would have certainly damaged the market for tax credit equity for renewable energy equity investments. But also on the flip side, I say it doesn't give us an opportunity to try to lower the capital requirements for housing credit, new markets, or historic credits, which is something we had hoped to try to do as part of the Basel III process. So I think we certainly dodged a bullet for renewable energy, but I think we're potentially losing an opportunity for the other community development incentives.
And if you could say a few words about the future of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that are currently under conservatorship, and have been under conservatorship probably a lot longer than when the conservatorship started, many expected. So there's a lot of thought about the potential impact of coming out of conservatorship and what impact it might have in the both the near term and the longer term with the new administration.
Yeah, great question, Mike. And first thing I want to just point out is that due to a Supreme Court case, Collins versus FHFA, the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. Sandra Thompson essentially is now a political at-will appointment, and so she'll be likely asked to leave and will be probably dealing with an interim director until Trump nominates a replacement. And I'll say that I don't anticipate a radical change to the housing credit equity investments that both Fannie and Freddie have been making. But there has been lots of chatter about a desire to try to release Fannie and Freddie from conservatorship. It's not as simple as it sounds. There's a lot of different ways it can be done. There's sort of administrative steps that can be done without Congress, but other elements that require Congress to weigh in. And I think certainly the way it happens is going to be crucial on how it will affect housing finance. And so we'll certainly be keeping an eye on, and this will be one of the big issues in the affordable housing policy that we'll be monitoring outside of taxes. And I think there'll be a lot of oxygen consumed on this issue. But I just do want to remind folks that the affordable housing goals are statutory and are not likely to change considerably. It will still require 60 votes in the Senate to change those. And same thing for the duty to serve mandate that Fannie and Freddie have. I will say that the funding in the Housing Trust Fund and the Capital Market Fund could be vulnerable to budget reconciliation. As I mentioned, there are instructions in the budget resolution. They write instructions to the House Financial Services and Senate banking committees to incur savings. They could go after these sources of funding. So this is something certainly those who care about those resources need to be advocating in front of the Republican Congress to keep. The other concern what we're following is that every February, the amounts that Fannie and Freddie has set aside for the Housing Trust Fund, the Capital Market Fund, are required to be transferred. The FHFA director authorizes that, and so there's a question about whether an acting or interim FHFA director might sit on that transfer and not transfer those funds. And also there's various existing funds in the Capital Market Fund that haven't been awarded to CFIs or nonprofit organizations. There's a question of what happens to those resources. So those are things we're certainly going to be following in the coming years.
Thank you for that, Peter. I don't think I'm going to ask you to speculate on the Treasury Secretary, but and maybe in the course of this webinar, it's already been announced. I'm not checking my phone, but we do expect obviously a Treasury Secretary to be a nominee to be selected soon, if it hasn't been selected already. And then we'll have more to come on that, because from there, from the Treasury Secretary selection, then you start getting some of the other positions start to be determined, and there'll be a lot more to know and more to come on this front. And the last area that we'll cover, and appreciate all of you who are still with us on the webinar, I appreciate you joining us, is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And Peter, what should we expect from the Department of Housing?
So I think one thing is pretty clear, that is there's going to be a challenge to HUD spending. We do expect, and we have a slide coming up on that. There's going to be a lot of pressure on domestic non-defense spending, and we know that the Republican Congress is likely to target that and cut in the coming years. And for example, we just wanted to show the House HUD spending bill did target many areas, and we expect more of the same in the coming years. And the most vulnerable programs are the community development block grants, the home investment partnership program, the choice neighborhoods. Those are all, I think, very, very vulnerable in the coming years, and therefore those of you who care about that are going to need to advocate to sustain those. But all of, I think, HUD spending in general will be challenging. I think public housing, especially the capital funding, might also be under stress. That's one key issue there. And in terms of policies, to go back to that previous slide, We are expecting maybe some further changes along the lines to the rental assistance demonstration. We know the Trump administration supported that and wanted to advance it. It actually would have changed it from being a demonstration to a permit program and removed the limit on the number of public housing units that could be converted under the rental assistance demonstration. We do think there's going to be efforts to try to do more deregulation of housing authorities and other issues there. And then, of course, we do think affordability furthering fair housing has been the political hot potato. While it is a part of the underlying Fair Housing Act, the rules and regulations have gone back and forth. President Obama proposed regulations; those were rescinded by President Trump. And while President Biden never actually finalized his version of those regulations, we might go back to where they were in the first Trump administration. And then lastly, I just want to note there are a number of HUD programs with competitive funding, and we anticipate that, like in the first Trump administration, many of those competitive HUD programs might prioritize, give positive competitive points in the application for doing those investments in opportunity zones. And so that's something we're going to keep an eye on as well.
And I would just note, as I did earlier, just to say it again, is the whole reprioritizing of opportunity zones. You could see that through the new market tax credit application process, just to kind of across the board. You can see opportunity zones reappearing in various competitive programs designed to serve distressed communities. And then to close it off here, there are a number of Novogradic events that are coming up. We have our 2024 Housing Tax Credit Conference, December 5th and 6th at the Four Seasons in Las Vegas. And we will have a Washington wire there. So we'll have a lot more to discuss. We'll know every day we know more. So we'll have more to discuss there. And then a month later, we'll be in Fort Lauderdale. And we'll have our Affordable Housing on the East Coast Conference. And that's going to be January 16th and 17th. It'll be after the new Congress has stepped in and before the inauguration. And then at the end of January in San Diego, we'll have our annual New Markets Tax Credit Conference. All these conferences are always kind of well attended. There's great opportunity to network. And there'll be a lot more known than we know right now. And we're going to be able to say that for a while. In terms of Q&A, I said we'd stop at 10 more minutes, so I have a minute to go. All I'll generally say, there are a number of questions coming in, like transition rules and the rest. And one of the reasons why it's so important to stay close and be watching the details is when the House bill ultimately comes out, assuming that they're successful and can get 218 votes, the House tax bill, it'll end there, to whatever extent it's ending any existing tax incentives or funding levels and the rest, there will be some type of transition rule. And it's going to be very important to be monitoring what those transition rules are and what you have to do to qualify and be eligible for it. Knowing, of course, that it'll then go to the Senate, and the Senate might modify those transition rules. And then if it goes to the Senate and the Senate passes, either the House will pass the Senate bill or they'll go to some conference to try to resolve the differences. So just know that those transition rules will be the details of the legislation. Once again, I mentioned our working groups. There's New Market Tax Credit Working Group, Low Income Housing Tax Credit Working Group, Renewable Energy Tax Credit Working Group. We're going to be forming this one on the new laws proposal for raising capital to renovate existing low-income housing or convert existing housing into rent-restricted housing. And then we have our Neighborhood Homes Tax Credit Working Group. And then there's a few others beyond that I didn't name. But I'd encourage you to participate in those to the extent that you're able. And I'll turn it back to you, Peter, to make any closing comments. And then we'll bring this webinar to a close.
Thanks, Mike. And thanks again for bearing with us. I guess I just want to reemphasize, 2025 is going to be quite a consequential year for tax legislation. And it's going to be incumbent on you to really follow it. It will happen faster than you might imagine. And you need to be prepared for that. And we have lots of resources available for you through the working groups, through our conferences, and through our the podcasts and other future webinars. So we encourage you to keep in touch, and advocacy is going to be key. We don't nothing happens unless people advocate for it, and so I think and one of the best ways to do that, I always feel duty bound to close out on, is to invite your member of Congress to see your property, see your investment in their districts, because once they see it and they can imagine their minds, then they're much more likely to protect it and potentially enhance it. So with that, I'll turn it back to you to close.
Great, thank you for that, Peter. And bear in mind that we do have additional slides in the deck that we handed out. And we did run over, but think of this as 12 minutes of bonus time to add value to the webinar. And if you have suggestions for additional webinars, if you think we should go more detail, do a webinar just on renewable energy in more detail in terms of the implications or other particular incentives or other themes for webinars, please, when you go through and evaluate this session, I hope you'll give us a good review, but if I want an honest one. But if you have other suggestions for additional webinar events and or Tax Credit Tuesdays, please share them with us. And with that, thank you again. And thank you again, Peter. You do so much for the broader community development space and clean energy space. And you've been so valuable over the many, many years you've been in this area, and obviously within Novogradac and before, and you're going to play such a critical role over the next 12 plus months. So thank you for all that you do.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
Okay. Ciao.